But let's begin with the last of our leader interviews. It is with Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland and leader, of course, of the Scottish National Party. The SNP holds 56 out of the 59 Scottish seats at Westminster, and Nicola Sturgeon has promised, of course, another referendum on independence after the details of the Brexit deal are known. When I talked to her earlier today, like all of us, she was very concerned by the events in London on Saturday night.
Well, obviously, like everybody else, I was horrified at the events that unfolded in London on Saturday night. I mean, it is just everybody's worst nightmare, and my thoughts are with all those who lost loved ones and those who sustained injuries. Coming so soon on the back of the Manchester attack, I think it just compounded that sense of horror and shock. But the concert last night in Manchester, I think, demonstrated very, very powerfully that the terrorists won't prevail because love overcomes hate. And that sounds like a cliche. It is in many respects a cliche, but I do think it sums up the spirit that many people have at the moment.
We have, though, to get back to the politics. That's the business of this week. So what about the Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying enough is enough? What about Jeremy Corbyn alleging that perhaps it's impossible? I think the quote is, "You cannot protect the public on the cheap." He's talked about cuts and the way, in fact, that might have made us, London, more vulnerable than it might have been in the past. Yeah. Where do you stand on all this?
Well, I think it's really important that in the few days up to the general election, we're able to have this debate robustly. I mean, there is a part of all of us that doesn't want to get into the cut and thrust of politics when people have died and, relatives are grieving, people are lying injured in hospital. But when I heard Theresa May say enough is enough yesterday, I felt two things. Firstly, I agreed with her that that is the sentiment we all feel and share. But secondly, I don't think anybody can escape the thought that Theresa May's been Home Secretary for the past number of years, and many of the things she was saying, I guess, raised questions about the action she took as Home Secretary. We can't keep the public safe by cutting police numbers. In Scotland, we haven't cut police numbers. We've maintained the number of police officers. We've also taken steps in the last few months to increase the number of trained armed officers. Now, there will always be occasions where, even with, many police on the streets, there are going to be occasions where terrorists manage to commit these kind of acts, but we must have really tough conversations about this.
That mercifully Scotland has not been the victim of any sort of terrorist attack since Glasgow Airport back in 2007. But do you know of attacks that have been thwarted?
Well, our intelligence and security services work with Police Scotland to make sure that people are under surveillance when that is required, and that action is taken to keep us safe. Scotland is not immune from this threat. There's no intelligence of any specific threat right now, but that shouldn't make any of us complacent, and we work very hard with the police. The police here in Scotland work very hard with colleagues elsewhere in the UK. The Scottish Government works with the UK Government. I readily accept that with the best arrangements in the world, there will be occasions where the terrorists manage to commit these atrocities. But we must, I think, have a robust discussion about policing, about security, about relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, countries that are thought to be funding jihadist groups. There's a report that the UK government seems to be refusing to publish.
I'm interested in that. You've tweeted about that, in fact, today, saying the PM has got to give a clear commitment to publish this report. For the benefit of our listeners who might not know a great deal about it, which I suspect is most of us, tell me, what is it and why do you believe it's being suppressed?
This is a report that David Cameron agreed to carry out, looking at the funding streams to jihadist groups, looking at what countries may be providing funding and support to these groups. Now, I've not seen the report. I don't know what's in it, but there is a suspicion that it will show that countries like Saudi Arabia, which of course, the UK sells arms to and has relationships with, may be shown to be a significant funder of these kinds of groups.
And
now,
of course, thousands of British jobs are dependent on that relationship. There's no getting away from that.
Well, that may be true, but I also think we have to have, very clear sort of views based on principle around this. Theresa May said yesterday, and in the interests of consensus here, I agree that we must have robust conversations, sometimes very difficult conversations around this, but you cannot simply say enough is enough as some kind of rhetorical device without being prepared to have open discussions.
So what would you do?
Well, I think the first step is to publish a report like this and let's have an honest debate on that. I do think we should be asking some very serious questions about arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia. And, that's the point I'm making. There are so many issues that have to be confronted as part of this, and we can't pick and choose. Some of them will be difficult, some of them will be extremely difficult. But if we're serious about doing everything possible to stem this kind of threat, then that's the kind of approach we've got to take.
Why do you believe your personal approval ratings have slipped so low?
I wouldn't accept they've slipped so low. Look, leaders' approval ratings will go up and down, and I think it's probably the wrong thing for leaders to pay too much attention to that rather than to do what they think are the right things in different circumstances. But, I would say that my approval ratings compare pretty favourably to those of any other leader in Scotland or the UK.
It's simply that they've never been as low as they are now. And obviously you've been around a relatively long period of time and people's views do change. Yeah. But you're not exactly in the rosy glow of public adoration at the moment, are you?
Look, the SNP is going into this election, and I take nothing for granted about the poll on Thursday, but we're going into this election significantly ahead in the polls of our nearest rivals. We're on course. Again, I stress I'm not taking a single vote for granted, but we're on course to win this election in Scotland. Now, I think that's a pretty strong position to be in. Of course, if you're in government, if you've been in government as the SNP has now for 10 years, then there will be people who disagree with you on a number of things. But for a party that's been in government for that length of time to have the kind of poll position that we've got, I think is a positive, not a negative.
Yeah, nevertheless, you are in a slightly strange position because the SNP won, 56 out of 59 seats last time round. You are going to lose seats this time.
You're not seriously expecting me to concede that 3 days before an election?
I put it to you, Nicola Sturgeon, there is a very strong possibility that you will lose seats, not gain them.
Look, we're fighting every constituency to win it. We, yes, had an absolutely exceptional election result in 2015, 2 years ago. And, I recognise that, but we're fighting every seat to win and we're fighting hard. We've got excellent candidates across all of these seats. We've had really strong MPs in the House of Commons over the past 2 years. And I think it's recognised even by the SNP's harshest critics that although we've not been the official opposition in the House of Commons, we have in so many ways been the effective opposition. And if Scotland wants to make sure that we continue to have that strong voice standing up for Scottish interests, then electing SNP MPs is the only way to secure it.
You have said that you would support a coalition with Labour if it came to it.
Oh, no, I haven't actually.
Well,
I don't favour formal coalitions. What I've said, and
the accusation put to you would be that you would prop up a Jeremy Corbyn government.
In fact, rather than accusations.
Well, go on. Tell me what it is you will do.
Well, I've said, and I said this in 2015. If the parliamentary arithmetic post the election supported this, I would want the SNP to be part of a progressive alternative to a Tory government. I don't favour formal coalitions. I'm talking something that would be much more on an issue-by-issue basis to make sure we had government that invested in public services, not cut public services, supported pensioners' rights, not undermined those rights. But I've also said very clearly in this election that, albeit the polls have narrowed, I still think the likelihood is the Tories will win this election, but it's no longer inevitable that Theresa May will have a bigger majority, and Scotland could stop that happening.
But if you
making sure we don't elect Tory MPs.
If you were part of a progressive alliance, as you would see it with the Labour Party, it would be really, really interesting, because what the most important task ahead of a Jeremy Corbyn-led government would be getting a decent Brexit deal for Britain. But actually, that is the last thing that would suit the SNP and its desire for independence. Well, it isn't rubbish. It's absolutely true.
I want to see the UK get a good Brexit deal. I've got huge doubts that is going to happen, and I can't suspend my critical faculties. But the idea that I don't want to see the UK get a good Brexit deal is
but only a bad Brexit deal would serve the interests of the SNP.
Look, my concern first and foremost is the interests of Scotland, and a bad Brexit deal, whether that means a bad deal or no deal, which Theresa May still contemplates, would put tens of thousands of Scottish jobs on the line. It would hit investment in our country. It would damage our public finances and therefore our ability to invest in public services. So I don't want the UK to get a bad Brexit deal. I didn't want Brexit at all, but now that we are where we are, I want to get a good deal, but I want that deal to be one that recognises there are different interests, different needs, different priorities in different parts of the UK.
But if the three unionist parties in the election in Scotland on Thursday get more than 50% of the vote, as they might well, how on earth can you still argue that there is a real case for a thirst for independence?
Well, firstly, what we're finding in Scotland, which I think probably is a recognition of the strength of the SNP's position, is other parties and some commentators trying to redefine what victory in an election means. If the SNP wins the election, we get more votes and more seats than anybody else, then by any definition of democracy, that's a win for the SNP in the election. Now, my position on a referendum is straightforward. I think at the end of the Brexit process, not now, but at the end of the process, we should have a choice about our future, because the alternative to that is that we simply have to accept Brexit regardless of how damaging it's going to be.
What do you say to your critics who do point to the fact that there are real problems within the Scottish education system, which used to be, I think, the envy of the rest of Britain back in the day? NHS has problems as well. Your critics simply say you have a one-track mind, you're obsessed with independence, and you aren't actually doing the do on the ground, making Scotland work on a daily basis.
Well, that's not true. I mean, you take NHS, for example. Yes, the NHS in Scotland, like health services across the developed world, face challenges because of rising demand. But the NHS in Scotland is, by some considerable distance, the best performing of any in the UK.
Well, it's certainly, you spend more money on it, but I don't think there's much evidence that it is the best performing.
Again, with the greatest of respect, I'd suggest you might have wanted to look into this a bit more. Take our accident and emergency departments, for example. Best performing in the UK for 25 months running, and it's about 10 percentage points better than the NHS in England, and the gap is even wider if you compare it with Wales and Northern Ireland. Yes, we've got a budget that we have made sure is rising, but we've got more nurses, doctors, other health professionals per head of population. So on many of these measures, our health service performing better than any other in the UK. So yes, there are challenges.
Average life expectancy is two years younger than the rest of the country.
That has been the case for generations in Scotland, but we're taking, so for example, we became the first part of the UK to have a ban on smoking in public places. We're trying, although we're held up in the courts at the moment, to tackle alcohol misuse by introducing a minimum price for alcohol, again leading the UK. So your proposition to me here is that somehow these things are worse in Scotland because of the SNP. And what I'm demonstrating to you is, yes, there are challenges, but actually under an SNP government, the health service is performing better than the health service anywhere else in the UK, and that's factual.
Many people know that you do offer free tuition in Scotland at university, but you have, which will surprise a lot of people, a poor record in getting students from poorer backgrounds into university. Well, why is that? It should be the opposite, surely.
Again, that didn't start with the SNP. That's been a long-standing issue. I should say there are some facts that make it tricky to compare statistics north and south of the border. For example, a much higher proportion of Scottish students do higher education courses in further education colleges, and that's not taken account of in the figures. But yes, we've had that challenge, but there are now record numbers of young people overall going to university, including a higher number than ever before of young people from our most deprived communities. So I'm not sitting here telling you we don't have challenges or that everything in Scotland is perfect, but your central proposition that somehow things are worse because of the SNP is just demonstrably not true. On many of these things, we're seeing improvements, and on many of the kind of issues we're talking about, Scotland is doing better than the rest of the UK. Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, to go back to that, not that I think that Jeremy Corbyn is going to be Prime Minister, but his manifesto, many of the key commitments in that are policies that the SNP is already implementing in Scotland. We're leading the way when it comes to progressive policies.
Nicola Sturgeon, we have asked every single other leader or person sent by the party to appear in that role on this programme over the last couple of weeks.
I can't imagine what you're referring to.
Oh, nor can I. We have asked them this question: which single policy do you consider vital to introduce to improve the lives of women? So what would you say to that?
I think childcare would be the one, and it's one we're focusing on in Scotland now. Childcare, expanding that, is not just important for women, it's important for children, it's important for parents generally. But in terms of supporting women to get into or back into the workplace, helping them to raise the living standards for their families. I think extending childcare in Scotland, we're working just now to double the provision of state-funded childcare, and I would say that of many other policies would be my priority.
That was Nicola Sturgeon talking to me earlier this morning.